The thing about the Kansas prairie that most people misunderstand is this. It looks flat and empty and harmless, a sea of grass stretching to the horizon in every direction, a landscape so featureless that you can watch your dog run away for 3 days before it disappears. But that flatness is not safety. That flatness is danger, because when the winter storms come howling down from Canada with nothing between the Arctic and your front door except 1,000 miles of open ground, there is no shelter. There are no hills to hide behind, no forests to break the wind, no natural features of any kind that might slow the killing cold that descends without warning and stays without mercy. The settlers who came to Kansas in the 1870s and 1880s built wooden houses because that is what they knew how to build, because lumber was available from the railroads that were pushing west, because a wooden house looked civilized and permanent in a way that the sod houses of earlier settlers did not. They built their wooden houses on the flat prairie and congratulated themselves on their progress, on their modernity, on their escape from the primitive conditions that had characterized frontier life a generation earlier. They did not understand that they had built death traps. A wooden house on the Kansas prairie in winter is not shelter. It is a box that the wind blows through, that the cold penetrates, that loses heat faster than any stove can produce it when the temperature drops to 40 below and the wind screams at 60 miles per hour. The walls flex and creak. The gaps around windows and doors let in drafts that freeze water 10 feet from the stove. The roof groans under the weight of snow that the wind piles against every vertical surface. And when the storm lasts 3 days, when the firewood runs out because no one can reach the woodpile through the drifts, when the temperature inside drops below freezing, despite everyone huddling together under every blanket in the house, people die. They die of cold in their own homes, in the houses they built to shelter them, in the wooden boxes that could not withstand the forces that the prairie unleashed. In the settlement of Plainview, Kansas, in the winter of 1884, a blizzard killed 11 people. 11 people who froze in their homes, or froze trying to reach their barns, or froze walking between buildings that were 50 feet apart, but might as well have been 50 miles when visibility dropped to 0, and the wind stole every calorie of heat from every inch of exposed skin. 11 people dead, in a settlement of perhaps 200, because no one had built shelter that could survive what the prairie could do. One of the dead was Thomas Hobbs, a farmer who had frozen trying to reach his livestock. His wife had died the previous summer of fever, leaving their son Silas, 11 years old, an orphan with no family and no one willing to take him in. The settlement held a meeting after the burials to decide what to do with the boy. No one wanted him. He was not old enough to be useful, not young enough to be endearing, not connected to any family that might feel obligated to help. He was simply a problem to be solved, a mouth to be fed, a burden to be distributed. Mayor Cornelius Whitmore proposed a solution that satisfied everyone except the boy himself. "The child can stay in the old soddy on the Perkins claim," Whitmore announced. "The Perkins family abandoned it when they built their proper house. It is not fit for habitation, but it is better than nothing, and the boy is not fit for placement, so it is a match." The decision was made without consulting Silas, without asking what he wanted, without considering that an 11-year-old child might have opinions about being abandoned in a collapsing sod house on the edge of a settlement that had just watched his father freeze to death. The decision was made because it was convenient, because it cost nothing, because it allowed everyone to feel that they had done something without actually doing anything. Silas listened to the decision and said nothing. He had learned in 11 years of life on the prairie that children's opinions did not matter, that protests only made things worse, that the only power he had was the power to survive despite what adults decided for him. If they wanted to put him in a soddy, he would live in a soddy. And if the soddy was not good enough to survive the next blizzard, he would make it good enough. He would make something that could not fail the way his father's wooden house had failed. Something that would protect him when the wind came screaming and the temperature dropped and the world above turned white and deadly. He would dig. If you want to understand how an 11-year-old orphan spent 3 years digging a labyrinth under the Kansas prairie that would shelter 90 people through the worst blizzard in living memory, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The abandoned soddy that Whitmore had assigned to Silas was barely standing. The sod walls had begun to crumble, the dirt roof leaked in every rain, and the interior smelled of mold and decay and the despair of the family that had abandoned it. But the floor was interesting. The floor was packed earth, hard as stone from years of feet walking across it, but earth nonetheless. Earth that could be dug, earth that could be removed, earth that could be replaced with empty space that might, if Silas thought about it correctly, become shelter that no blizzard could destroy. He began digging the first night. He had no shovel, so he used a broken hoe that the Perkins family had left behind. He had no pick, so he used a heavy stone that he had found in the creek bed. He had no plan, so he simply dug downward, removing earth one handful at a time, piling it outside the soddy where no one would notice, creating a hole in the floor that grew deeper inch by inch, night after night, week after week. The settlers of Plainview noticed nothing. They rarely thought about the orphan in the abandoned soddy. And when they did think about him, they assumed he was doing whatever orphans did, surviving or not surviving according to his own resources. They did not visit. They did not check on him. They did not wonder what he was doing with the dirt that accumulated in piles around the old sod house. They simply forgot about him, which was exactly what Silas wanted. The first year was about depth. Silas dug straight down until he hit clay at 6 feet. Then he dug sideways, hollowing out a chamber beneath the floor of the soddy that was 10 feet wide and 12 feet long and tall enough to stand in if you were 11 years old and not yet full grown. He lined the walls with stones from the creek, fitted together without mortar in a technique he figured out through trial and error, creating a surface that would not collapse and would not let the surrounding earth push inward. He built a proper entrance, a wooden door set into the floor of the soddy that opened onto a ladder descending into the chamber below. He built a chimney, a narrow shaft that vented smoke from a small fire pit up through the soddy's existing chimney, so that anyone watching from outside would see smoke from the sod house and assume the boy was living normally above ground. He built ventilation, 2 narrow shafts that brought fresh air in and let stale air out, preventing the underground space from becoming a tomb. By the end of his first year alone, Silas had created a survival shelter that could hold perhaps 10 people in the kind of cramped desperation that a blizzard required. It was not comfortable. It was not spacious. But it was underground, surrounded on all sides by earth that maintained a constant temperature of 55 degrees, regardless of what the air above was doing. Protected from wind that could not reach below the surface, insulated by the same prairie that had killed his father above ground. The second year was about expansion. Silas had survived his first winter in the underground chamber without difficulty, emerging in spring stronger and more confident than he had been in autumn. The settlement had not checked on him all winter. The settlement had assumed he had probably died and had not bothered to confirm. When he appeared in town in April, dirty and thin, but very much alive, Mayor Whitmore had looked at him with surprise that bordered on disappointment. "Still here," the mayor had said. "Well, try not to cause trouble." Silas caused no trouble. He worked odd jobs through the summer, earning tools and supplies that he could not make himself. He acquired a proper shovel, a pick, a saw, nails, timber beams that he hauled to his soddy one at a time over months of effort. He gathered stones from every creek bed within walking distance, piling them in caches that he would retrieve when he needed them. He prepared for a second year of digging with the systematic determination of someone who had nothing else to live for except the project that gave his life meaning. The second winter, he expanded. He dug a second chamber behind the first, then a third off to the side, then connecting tunnels that allowed movement between the spaces. He installed timber beams to support the ceilings, proper construction that would not collapse under the weight of earth above. He built additional fire pits, additional ventilation shafts, additional storage alcoves where food and fuel could be stockpiled against the blizzards that would inevitably come. By the end of his second winter underground, Silas had a complex that could shelter perhaps 30 people. He was 12 years old, and he had built more than most adults would build in a lifetime. The third year was about capacity. Silas had stopped thinking about himself alone. He had started thinking about what would happen if a blizzard, like the one that killed his father, came again. If the wooden houses of Plainview began failing again. If people began dying again because they had built shelter that could not withstand what the prairie could do. He did not like the people of Plainview. They had abandoned him, mocked him, forgotten him. But they were people, and people did not deserve to freeze to death because they were too foolish to build proper shelter, any more than his father had deserved to freeze to death, trying to save livestock that died anyway. The third winter, he built for 90. He dug chambers until his arms could barely lift the shovel. He hauled stones until his back screamed with every step. He installed beams, built fire pits, created ventilation systems, stockpiled food and fuel and water and everything else that 90 people would need to survive underground for days at a time. He did not know if 90 people would ever need his shelter. He only knew that if they did, the shelter would be ready. Mayor Whitmore discovered the project in the autumn of 1887. 3 years after Silas had begun digging. The mayor had come to the abandoned soddy to inform the Orphan that the land was being reclaimed for a new settler, that Silas would need to find somewhere else to live, that his time squatting on Perkins' property was over. What he found was not a squatter in a collapsing sod house. What he found was a door in the ground, and below it, an underground world that should not have existed. "You have been digging," Whitmore said, his voice caught between astonishment and outrage. "For 3 years, you have been digging under my town like a gopher." Silas stood at the entrance to his underground complex, 13 years old, lean and strong and utterly unintimidated by the man who had condemned him to survival alone. "Not your town," he said. "Under the prairie. The prairie belongs to no one. What is under it belongs to whoever digs it." Whitmore descended the ladder despite Silas's objections, walked through the chambers and tunnels, examined the construction with increasing disbelief. The boy had built something that Whitmore himself could not have built, something that none of the adults in Plainview could have built, something that represented 3 years of labor that should have been impossible for a child working alone. "This is madness," Whitmore pronounced when he emerged. "You have dug a gopher hole, a warren, a burrow for a creature too primitive to build a proper house above ground. This is not civilization. This is regression to the condition of animals. It is warm in winter, Silas said. The wind cannot reach it. The temperature never drops below 55 degrees. When the next blizzard comes, the blizzard that will kill people in their proper houses above ground, my gopher hole will still be warm. Whitmore laughed. The laugh was meant to be dismissive, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it, a flicker of memory about the blizzard that had killed 11 people, including the boy's father. "You are a strange child," the mayor said, "strange and damaged and destined for nothing good. But I will not evict you today. Stay in your burrow if you wish. When you freeze to death this winter, we will fill in your holes and pretend you never existed." Silas watched the mayor walk away and said nothing. The blizzard would come. The blizzard always came. And when it came, he would be ready. The blizzard arrived on January 12th, 1888. It arrived on a morning that had been unseasonably warm, temperatures in the 30s that had convinced everyone the worst of winter was over. Children walked to school in light coats. Farmers went out to check on livestock without bundling against the cold. The settlement of Plainview went about its business as if January were merely an inconvenience rather than a threat. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than an hour. The wind rose from nothing to 60 miles per hour in minutes. The visibility dropped from miles to feet as the snow came horizontally, so thick and fast that the air itself seemed to turn white. The schoolhouse blizzard, as it would come to be known, killed over 200 people across Kansas and Nebraska that day. It killed them because they were caught outside and could not find shelter. It killed them because they were inside wooden houses that could not hold heat against the wind. It killed them because the flat, treeless prairie offered nothing to break the storm, nothing to slow the wind, nothing to provide refuge from conditions that no human body could survive without protection. In Plainview, the wooden houses began failing within hours. The wind found every gap, every crack, every poorly sealed joint. The stoves that had kept families comfortable on ordinary winter days could not keep pace with the heat loss that the blizzard caused. The fires burned hot, but the rooms grew cold, and families huddled together under blankets and watched their breath condense and prayed for the storm to end. By nightfall, the first families had abandoned their homes. They could not stay inside and survive. They could not go outside and survive. They had no options except death, and death was coming for them 1 degree at a time as the temperature dropped and the wood ran out, and the cold crept closer with every passing hour. Thomas Reeves was the first to remember the orphan. "The orphan who lived in the ground," Reeves said to his wife, his children already shivering despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. "The boy who dug under the prairie." Whitmore called it a gopher hole. But gophers survive winter, do they not? They survive because they are underground, where the wind cannot reach. The Reeves family fought their way to the abandoned soddy through snow that was already waist deep, through wind that knocked them down and tried to steal their breath, through a white void where direction meant nothing, and only luck kept them from walking in circles until they froze. They found the door in the ground because Thomas Reeves fell on it, literally stumbling over the entrance that was buried under drifting snow. They pounded on the wood, screaming to be heard over the wind, begging for entrance into the earth. Silas opened the door. Below the howling chaos of the surface, the underground complex was warm and quiet. The temperature was 54 degrees. The air was still. The fire pits were burning low and steady, producing heat that the earth contained rather than losing to the wind. The Reeves family descended into the earth and stood in the main chamber and wept with relief. "How?" Thomas Reeves asked when he could speak. "How is this possible?" "3 years of digging," Silas replied. 3 years of preparation for the storm that I knew would come. "Welcome to my gopher hole, Mr. Reeves. Please make yourself comfortable." More families came. The Reeves family had left tracks in the snow, barely visible, but enough to follow. The Henderson family came next, then the Marshalls, then families that Silas did not know by name. Strangers who had heard somehow that there was shelter in the ground, that the orphan boy had dug something that could save them. They came all night, fighting through the storm, following the fading tracks, pounding on the door and begging to be let in. Silas let them all in. By midnight, there were 40 people in his underground complex. By dawn, there were 60. By the end of the first day of the storm, there were 93 people packed into chambers that Silas had dug for 90, spilling into tunnels, filling every space that could hold a human body. The complex was designed for this, and the ventilation systems that Silas had built kept the air fresh despite the crowding. The multiple fire pits provided heat that the earth contained. The storage alcoves held food and water that Silas had stockpiled for exactly this situation. The design was not comfortable, but comfort was not the point. Survival was the point, and survival was happening all around him as 93 people who should have frozen to death huddled in the warm earth and waited for the storm to end. Mayor Whitmore arrived on the second day. He had waited in his own house as long as possible, convinced that his well-built home with its expensive stove and its multiple fireplaces would outlast any storm. But the stove could not keep up. The fireplaces could not produce enough heat. The wind found gaps that Whitmore had not known existed, and the temperature inside his fine house dropped below freezing despite everything he burned to stop it. He arrived at the underground entrance, half frozen, his expensive clothes torn by the wind, his dignity stripped by the desperation that had driven him to seek shelter in the gopher hole he had mocked. Silas opened the door and looked at him. The mayor who had condemned him to the abandoned soddy, the mayor who had called his life's work a burrow for primitive creatures, the mayor who had promised to fill in his holes when he froze to death. "May I come in?" Whitmore said. His voice was barely audible over the wind. "Please, I am freezing." Silas stepped aside. The shelter was built for 90. 94 would fit. Even mayors who had earned nothing except contempt could be saved if there was room to save them. Whitmore descended into the earth and found himself in a world he had not believed possible. Warm air surrounded him. Firelight flickered. People who should have been dead were alive, packed together but breathing, uncomfortable but surviving, saved by the labor of a 13-year-old orphan that the settlement had abandoned. The storm lasted 3 days. For 3 days, 94 people lived in the underground complex that Silas had dug over 3 years. They shared food that Silas had stockpiled. They breathed air that his ventilation system kept fresh. They stayed warm because 55-degree earth surrounded them on all sides, because the wind that was destroying the surface could not reach them underground, because one boy had understood what the prairie could do and had built accordingly. 7 people died in Plainview during the schoolhouse blizzard. 7 people who had not made it to the shelter, who had frozen in their homes or frozen trying to reach their barns, or frozen walking between buildings that might as well have been on different continents. 7 deaths in a storm that had killed over 200 across the region because 94 people had found refuge in a gopher hole that a damaged orphan had dug when he should have been dying of neglect. The reckoning came on the fourth day, when the storm had broken and the survivors emerged from the earth to see what was left of their world. The snow was piled in drifts 20 feet high. Houses that had stood were now collapsed. Barns that had held livestock were now tombs. The landscape was unrecognizable, white and silent and deadly, a preview of what everyone would have experienced if they had not found shelter underground. Whitmore spoke to the gathered survivors in the main chamber of Silas's complex, because it was the only space large enough to hold them and the only space warm enough to make speaking possible. "I called this place a gopher hole," Whitmore said. His voice was hoarse from 3 days of breathing recycled air, but his words were clear enough. "I called this boy damaged and strange and destined for nothing good. I told him that when he froze to death, I would fill in his burrow and pretend he never existed." He paused, looking at Silas, who stood apart from the crowd with the expression of someone who had heard enough speeches to distrust them all. 94 people are alive because this boy spent 3 years digging while I spent 3 years mocking. 94 people survived a storm that should have killed most of us because a 13-year-old orphan built shelter that none of us thought to build. I was wrong. I was dangerously, arrogantly wrong. And I owe this boy more than I can ever repay. Others spoke. Thomas Reeves, whose family had been first to arrive. Mrs. Henderson, whose children had slept safely in an alcove that Silas had dug 2 years earlier. Person after person, family after family, 93 separate debts of survival that could not be repaid with money or words, but that demanded acknowledgement nonetheless. Silas did not speak. He had nothing to say to people who had abandoned him, mocked him, forgotten him until they needed what he had built. He was not interested in their gratitude. He was not interested in their apologies. He was only interested in the fact that his shelter had worked, that his design had proven itself, that the 3 years of labor had produced exactly what he had intended to produce. The settlement rebuilt around the underground complex. Silas's shelter became the foundation for a new kind of construction, homes that had underground chambers for storm refuge, designs that combined above-ground living with below-ground survival. The wooden houses that had nearly killed everyone were rebuilt with storm cellars that connected to tunnels that connected to a network of underground spaces that could shelter the entire settlement if necessary. The phrase prairie basement entered the vocabulary of the Kansas frontier and spread across the Great Plains. It meant an underground shelter designed for storm survival, a recognition that the flat, treeless prairie required protection that could not be built above ground. It was spoken with respect, as if the speaker understood something about humility that could only be learned through nearly freezing to death, while a 13-year-old orphan stayed warm in the hole he had dug. Silas Hobbs lived in his underground complex for another 7 years, eventually emerging at age 20 to claim a homestead of his own. He married a woman who had survived the blizzard as a child in his shelter. He raised 4 children who all knew how to dig, who all understood that the prairie would kill you if you did not prepare for what it could do. He died at 68 in the winter of 1941, having survived every blizzard that Kansas produced in the intervening decades, because he never forgot what he had learned at 11 years old in an abandoned soddy with a broken hoe and a heavy stone. Above the main entrance to his underground complex, which the Kansas State Historical Society now maintains as a monument to frontier survival, Silas carved an inscription in the year after the schoolhouse blizzard that visitors still photograph today. The inscription reads, "They called it a gopher hole. 94 people lived in it while the wind killed everything above. The settlers who had mocked his digging, who had called him damaged and strange, who had condemned him to survival alone, and then begged him for shelter when their proper houses failed, they understood exactly what those words meant. And if you learned something from this story about underground shelter and prairie survival, and the 3 years of labor that saved 94 lives in 3 days, subscribe to this channel, because we have more stories about the forgotten engineering that kept people alive before modern construction made everyone forget what the earth could do. The prairie is still flat. The blizzards still come. The only question is whether we are humble enough to dig.